Don Alejo Garza Tamez was born in July 1933 in Allende, Nuevo Leon, a town in northern Mexico. Don Alejo's family ran a sawmill, and he was raised learning the trade and slowly expanding his property, eventually buying a ranch. But in 2010, Don Alejo's ranch had the misfortune of existing in an area that would be a great checkpoint for the drug trade, thus drawing the attention of the Los Zetas gang. The Los Zetas are a cartel gang known for they were not nice people. They were a former Mexican military that was trained to be a task force against the cartels, but then they realized they could make a lot more money by joining the drug trade, so that leads us to where we are today. On the 13th of November 2010, the cartel approached Don Alejo and asked him very nicely and not at all threateningly to vacate the premises in 24 hours in a real estate deal in which they would pay nothing in exchange for getting to live another day. Honestly, not the worst real estate offer I've heard of. Pretty generous. I would have taken it. But Don Alejo was a principled old man, 77 years old and the absolute pinnacle of humanity. This man hit him with the "I'll be waiting," and then the cartel just left and prepared to come back with backup. Don Alejo calmly grabbed his collection of guns and set them up at each window of the house. Within 24 hours, the cartel arrived. Don Alejo told them to leave, and they shot at him. So immediately he shot the two closest gangsters and the firefight commenced. The cartel began opening fire on Don Alejo's house, shooting at the window that he fired from. Except that he had already moved to another window and shot two more gangsters dead. And as they shifted to that window, he was already gone, moving from window to window. Eventually, the cartel got sick of it and kicked open the door, only to see him there, guns in hand. They were wounded but not killed. The cartel decided enough was enough, and they started using just grenades on Don Alejo's house. After blowing up a bunch of stuff, they retreated before the military could arrive. And about an hour later, the military did show up, and they found the aftermath of the firefight. Over 900 bullets were fired into Don Alejo's house, and multiple just complete craters from grenades were found. Sadly, the man was found dead in his bathroom, rifle still pointing to the door as he succumbed to the bullet wounds he received during the firefight. But still, he's an absolute legend. I don't usually cover recent stuff, but this was just too good. Sempronius Densis. The story of Sempronius Densis is less a story about him and more a story about Rome during a period of time in which Rome was at its most Roman, if you get what I mean. It was the year 69 AD. This wasn't just funny due to the number, but also that Rome decided to go through 4 emperors in a single year: Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and Vespasian. To begin with, I think it's safe to say that most people probably have a grasp of how Nero was as an emperor. He was psychotic and unhinged, he did some weird stuff involved killing his wife and replacing her with a dude that looked like her, and that's just one of the many, many stories of Nero's unhingedness. I could go through tons of stories about Nero, but all you really need to know is that he was hated by most of Rome by the time he was dethroned. And the first person to take his place was a silly little guy named Galba. Galba's first action as the self-proclaimed emperor was to march on Rome to claim his throne, as Galba was nowhere near Rome when Nero died. When Galba reached Rome, he had every soldier in the Roman garrison, unarmed or otherwise, killed, which immediately did not make him very popular. Otho, a governor at the time, who'd sided with Galba, began to see that he was slowly losing favor by making more and more drastic mistakes. His fall was imminent, and Galba was the most unpopular with the military, while Otho was really popular after befriending many of the Praetorian guards over the years, even going as far as to settle one of their debts with his own money. Eventually, Otho knew his time had come, and so with the help of the Praetorian Guard and some other fed-up Romans, he marched on Rome, causing a riot to break out. Galba and his heir went out into the crowd to try and reassure them and calm them down, and he was surrounded by guards. But when the guards saw Otho and his militia making their way through the crowd, every single one of them abandoned Galba. All except one. Yup, that's right, 7 paragraphs in, and I'm now bringing up Sempronius Densis. He's incredibly uninteresting as a person, but his final act here is just absolutely legendary. Sempronius refused to allow the militia to pass, and he held his ground against the soldiers who all wanted to kill Galba. Sempronius stood alone and defended Galba to the end. Unfortunately, we have no idea how long he fought for, or if he even killed anyone at all. But goddamn was he brave. He was noted and remembered for this act of valor, despite his idea to sacrifice himself for a pretty mid-emperor, all things considered. Granted, Galba didn't even serve a year. Pretty unfortunate, but hey, you gotta do what you gotta do. Okay, this next one is completely insane. We're talking about Vito Bertoldo. So this guy was a soldier in World War II. He was 25 when Pearl Harbor happened, and he decided to join the military despite his poor eyesight disqualifying him from the draft. His eyesight made him unable to be put into combat roles, but after requesting a transfer from his current job as a military police, he was given the role of a cook on the front lines in France. And while at a command post, he was volunteered as a guard. It was there when he noticed a group of Germans approaching off in the distance. And so he ran out into the streets with his gun and set himself up as the sole defensive line. For the next half a day, he stood fighting off the approach by himself while being shot at with everything from pistols to tanks. Yep, that's right. Tanks. Plural. As in, for 12 hours, this dude stood out in the open with his guns, fighting off soldiers and multiple tanks who were shelling the area around him with 8mm guns. You know, the guns designed to take down airplanes and other tanks. All those guns firing at a single guy. Just had to hammer home how impressive that is. After the 12 hours passed, Vito ran back inside the command post and took cover behind a table with his machine gun. From there, he fired through a window to hit oncoming enemies. But then one of the tanks shot a shell into the room, which sent him flying. But this dude was hacking or something, because he got back up and picked up his gun as 2 APCs in a tank rolled up on him. He waited for an opening before peeking out the window again and firing as the soldiers jumped out of the APCs and the tank fired at him. It's said that he mowed down 20 combatants here alone. Much later, the command post was finally changed to another building, as the tanks just kept pummeling the area. Vito stayed behind to cover everyone and remained watching their flank for the entire night. The morning after, he swapped over to a different building, the command post of a different battalion, and spent the next 24 hours defending that area. So, to recap, he's already been up for 24 hours straight fighting and dodging tanks. You think it's bad having to wake up early for school? Imagine how much infinitely more tired you'd be in this guy's shoes. Vito then fought off a tank, 2 heavy artillery guns, and 15 German infantry. It's said that the mobile artillery gun, which is more or less a tank, basically stuffed its barrel into the building that Vito was in and fired, sending him to the ground and messing up his allies. Then a team of friendly bazookas set the artillery truck on fire as Vito stood up and shot the people operating the flaming vehicle. Just such an insane guy. Then someone in charge finally got the bright idea to evacuate at night, but before they could put the plan to work, another assault started with ranged artillery and more tanks. So Vito's going on 48 hours of no sleep, and he begins fighting the attackers with white phosphorus grenades, which made them stop advancing, because if you know anything about white phosphorus, it's that you don't want to be anywhere near it. So the attacking soldiers made the smart decision to not walk into the white fog of death. So Vito holds the angle with his gun, and a tank shot at his location, sending him flying as it destroys his gun. But Vito still got back up and grabbed a new gun and fought to cover the withdrawal of his comrades again. And finally, after all this happens, he makes his way out, the last one to leave. I'm speechless. Never in my life have I seen someone roll so many consecutive nat 20s. Like, how did this man do it? I'm not kidding, this guy was absolutely nuts. Alright, these next 2 are probably the most popular, and considering how similar they are, they're gonna be together as the epitome of fighting until the very last breath. First up is the Viking of Stamford Bridge. So around 1066, Harald Hardrada of Norway was invading England to take it from the current king, Harold Godwinson. And the most extraordinary battle was in Stamford Bridge, which ironically was not the name of the bridge, but rather the name of the village that they fought in. Anyway, the fight was a losing battle for the Vikings. They retreated across a bridge, and 1 Viking remained, standing upon it, wielding a Dane axe. The English tried to fight him, but every person on the front line was killed by the Viking. Every wave introduced more and more Englishmen fighting on the bridge, but the Viking with the Dane axe just continued to cut them down. 40 men attempted to cross the bridge, and 40 men failed. This random Viking was only stopped when an English soldier snuck underneath the bridge and stabbed him with a spear, which killed him. That Viking's death led to the invading force being routed, and the English won, but their pride was heavily bruised. 1 guy killing 40 dudes, that's just embarrassing. This battle was especially amazing because it's remembered due to a fight on a bridge, but the village nearby was named Stamford Bridge. The 2 leaders were named Harold and Harold, and the lone Viking is called the Viking of Stamford Bridge, which really does not help with clarity, because is he the Viking of the bridge or the Viking of the town who died on a bridge in Stamford Bridge? But anyway, just something to think about. This whole Viking on the bridge thing is very similar to another story about a monk named Benkei. Benkei was a monk in the late 1180s, serving a samurai named Yoshitsune. There's a whole veritable feast of history between these two, but in Benkei's final moments, much like the Viking in Stamford 100 years earlier, it took place on a bridge. Yoshitsune was retreating to his castle to commit seppuku, and he needed time. So Benkei bought him that time by guarding the bridge as hundreds of samurai approached. The story goes that Benkei remained on the bridge with his Nagakiba at the ready. Wave after wave of samurai charged against him. Legend has it that he killed 500 samurai before they decided to just shoot Benkei with arrows. Yeah, these old last stands are always really embellished. But anyway, after however many samurai actually died, they decided to be cautious and to shoot arrows at Benkei instead. Benkei remained standing despite being a pincushion of arrows, so the samurai didn't approach anymore. Eventually, after some waiting, they did approach the bridge to see that he had propped himself up on his weapon and was long dead. Which brought Yoshitsune enough time to commit seppuku, so W friend, I guess. This next one's a fun one. We're going to need to go back over 1,000 years before Benkei and the Viking of Stamford Bridge. Agis III. Agis III was the son of the king of Sparta, Archimedes III, and he'd witnessed Sparta's decline in both power and social standing. Agis' father left Greece to fight against Macedonia, which was Alexander the Great's kingdom, along with fighting a few other Greek city-states. Archimedes did this after he and Agis fought off the Thebans just a decade earlier in some weird father-son bonding experience in which they tried to regain Sparta's lost land. Anyway, all that aside, but then Archimedes did the dad thing, and he went off on his own to find the illustrious pack of cigarettes, which means he became a mercenary commander, and when he saw the size difference between his army and the Macedonians, he dipped out, saying something like, "You guys got this, I gotta go grab a drink, be right back." And then he just vanished. We find out later that he was killed the same day when he was caught in another battle. Anyway, so Agis had been holding down the house, keeping it tidy for when his dad came back with the cigarettes that he'd promised, but instead he got a knock on the door. It was a messenger, telling him that his father passed away in a tragic cigarette-related four-car pileup, and now he owned the house and had to pay taxes. I don't think this bit's making any sense. Okay, wait, scratch all of that. Okay, anyway, Agis was king and Archidamus was dead. That's all you need to know. And so Sparta's land was divided up to its neighbors and enemies. Agis knew that it would take time for Sparta to recover, so he bided his time and waited for Macedonia to drop its guard. He sent out messengers to speak with various Persian military leaders, contractors, and even the king himself, asking for military supplies and asking them to attack Greece. The Persians did not need to be asked twice, and so they did, which marked the beginnings of a new war against Macedonia. 2 years later, Agis and some other Greek kingdoms who were opposed to Macedonian rule declared war against Alexander's kingdom, which is Macedonia. And after a successful battle, Agis moved forward to siege the great city of Megalopolis, which is where Agis made his last stand. Unfortunately for Agis, the city held against the siege, and a relief army made its way to battle Agis. The battle was lost, and he was wounded. While he and his men were retreating and they were carrying him, he realized he was dead weight, and so he told his men to leave him and retreat faster. Staying behind, unable to stand, he fought on his knees and killed a few of the approaching Macedonians. Eventually, he was killed by a javelin. And like so many other stories of last stands, his life was cut short by a sneak attack or a thing he couldn't reasonably defend himself from. You'd be surprised how many last stand stories end that way, at least in the ancient world. Okay, now we're talking about Roy Benavides. So this man was a staff sergeant in the Vietnam War, and he has a really cool story. But to keep it simple, this guy was made of tough stuff. He was undercover and he stepped on a landmine, and then he got rescued and sent to a hospital where he would, against doctor's orders, crawl across the ground and try to lift himself up against a wall. And he just did that until he could walk again. Yeah, this guy just speedran recovery so he could get back to Vietnam. 2 years later, now in 1968, Roy was in a forward operating base in Loc Ninh. Recently, a 12-man Special Forces recon team was dropped into a jungle west of the Loc Ninh area. They were pinned down and needed extraction, but the helicopters weren't able to land due to the hail of gunfire being laid down on them. And so Roy hears this distress call over the radio, and he saw the helicopters landing at the base to refuel, so he immediately volunteers to go help in a second extraction attempt. The 12-man team was either dead or wounded, and they needed help fast. Keep in mind that Roy was also part of this battle. So Roy got into the helicopter and they flew over. When they got to the 12-man team, the helicopter got as close as it could, and Roy jumped out and sprinted to the team. While doing so, he took a bullet to his right leg and a bullet hit his helmet. Upon reaching the group of injured soldiers, he proactively took charge and helped to pinpoint where the team should focus their gunfire. He then threw a few smoke grenades to alert the helicopter of his and the rest of the team's position. He shot some suppressing fire at the enemies while the other guys extracted, and he then searched for and found the dead squad leader's body and classified documents on it, which would not have been good if they fell into enemy hands. As he was carrying the body to safety, he was shot in the abdomen, and a grenade exploded, sending shrapnel into his back. While that was happening, he also saw the helicopter pilot get shot and crash with everyone inside. So immediately he secured the documents and sprinted to the downed helicopter and pulled people out of the wreckage to create a defensive perimeter, entrenching everyone in a safer but unsustainable defensive position. And so while the enemy fired upon the group, Roy was making sure everyone was holding up as he called in airstrikes to make another extraction attempt possible. But as he was doing that, another few bullets hit him in the thigh while he was fixing up the injuries of another team member. But that did not stop him. Just as the new extraction helicopter landed, Roy, one by one, carried the injured soldiers to the aircraft. He did it in multiple trips, and his second trip had him ambushed by an enemy soldier who he fought and killed with a knife, but not before sustaining a bayonet wound or two. Just as we go along, keep track of his injuries in your head. He's been shot a few times, stabbed a few times, and he's got some shrapnel in him. As he carried the last of the men to the helicopter, he saw two men approaching, and so he killed them before checking to see if all classified information and injured people were collected. And then he passed out from the pain and was dragged onto the helicopter. He managed to save 8 men after sustaining 37 bullet, shrapnel, and bayonet wounds. He was so exhausted and bloody that his eyes had fused shut. He was presumed dead, but as the doctor was zipping the body bag, he spat into the doctor's face to prove he was still alive. What a goddamn legend. These stories are just so unreal. In fact, when Roy received his Medal of Honor, Ronald Reagan even said that if it were a movie, I would not believe it. Which just shows how nuts life can get, especially in do or die situations. Anyway, subscribe, and YouTube thinks that you'll like this video next, so click on it.